We have breaking news in Ukraine. The first of the American supplied F-16s has crashed. And according to information that's coming out now, this literally is just the news has just broke within hours. Apparently, what we're being told is this actually happened on Monday, but they kind of kept it under wraps, and they're now starting to bring out some of the information and release it from Kiev. What we know so far is that one of their most effective pilots, one of their most trained pilots and experienced, a guy codenamed Moonfish, actually was killed in the crash as well. What they're saying so far is that in the process of the initial use of the F-16 in combat, when Russia fired this big barrage of over 200 drones and missiles on Monday throughout the depth of the Ukrainian country, that these F-16s were used. And Zelensky actually said this a day or so ago, that they had successfully intercepted some of the missiles and the drones and shot them down. What he didn't tell us at the time was that they lost one of their aircraft in the process. What's being claimed right now is that it was pilot error, they say, is resulted in that. But they also have said that they're going to bring an international consortium of experts to do an analysis of exactly what happened. So maybe we'll actually find out what truly happened. But I'm a little skeptical that pilot error caused the death of a pilot, because even if you make a mistake, in many cases, depending on the severity, of course, you can eject, or if you're hit, you can eject too. But given that the pilot was killed and in the process of trying to shoot down aircraft, trying to shoot down drones and missiles, it seems at least plausible that it was actually enemy fire. And of course, I'm sure that if that was the case, that Ukraine is not going to want to admit that. They're not going to want to say, hey, in the very first combat engagement, we lost one of our pilots. But look, the bigger issue is they did. And in the very first combat action, one of the planes was lost. And some reports are coming out that's still yet to be corroborated, but evidence suggested it could well be accurate that at least two of the F-16s were actually destroyed on the ground. Apparently, some of the video footage that the Ukraine side released about the preparation for the use of these F-16s on the ground in Ukraine included information in the background, which was geolocated and then later used by the Russian Air Force to knock out with their own missiles. So we'll have to see what ends up happening with that. But let's look at the bigger issue here. So many people have put so much stock in this, that the F-16 was going to make this big difference. They wanted to hesitate from saying, well, this is a silver bullet, it's going to make a difference. But yet that's kind of how they portrayed it anyway. Many in the West have said this is going to be a big change. It's going to make a big difference. It's going to maybe turn the tide, and it's going to show the Russians that they can't fly unimpeded. It's going to shoot down all the drones and the missiles that it goes up against, etc. But listen, as I've been saying from the very first time this was even announced, even before it was official, there's no panacea in an F-16. F-16 is a very fine plane. It does a good job for the United States, but it's no magic bullet. It's a plane, and it can be shot down like anything else. American pilots, with all of our systems, have long feared Russian air defense and Russian air-to-air missiles. So even our own trained pilots would be concerned about going against Russian aircraft and Russian anti-aircraft missiles and Russian fighters in the air. And the idea then that you're going to take a Soviet MiG-29 pilot and somebody who was trained in the Soviet system and then teach them how to fly an American F-16 in a very constrained amount of time was always a foolish endeavor. Because look, we train American F-16 pilots somewhere around 2 years before they're actually allowed to engage in combat operations, before they're able to go into a line unit. Even then, they're paired with more experienced pilots and continue to train even after they get to the location. But now then we're talking, a handful of months. And by the way, it's not just the limited amount of time that these pilots have had. It's also the fact that they had to first learn English. And then they have to try to take care of it, because the plane can't be restructured and changed to be a Ukrainian language aircraft. It's just not as simple as it may seem. In fact, it's much more difficult than it actually seems. And we had a glimpse of this back in February, because a lot of the training was initially done with Danish F-16s, and some of the training was done in that country. And we had this report, you may recall.
Despite harsh weather, time shortage, and the pressure to return to the fight, Ukrainian pilots and technicians are going through intense training at the Skrydstrup base in Denmark. The F-16 is highly complex. Ukraine has never had access to such an advanced system. It's an immense challenge for the technicians who will be responsible for the jet's maintenance. For Ukraine, the F-16 is crucial, especially now, as Russia is intensifying its attacks.
So you're seeing that this was, even acknowledged at the time. This is a very highly technical aircraft, much more so than the MiG-29s. The Soviet system put up capable aircraft, and their theory was in larger numbers, and then it worked within their system as well. That's one of the least understood and more difficult things for especially a Western audience to understand, but that for a pilot in F-16 to be effective, you have to first unlearn all the systems that you had. And I've heard this from some of the people who were doing the training. We've read some reports about it, that you have to unlearn the system and the way that you fly the aircraft to learn the new things about how to fly the F-16 and how to employ it, which were designed. The systems themselves were designed very differently. You also have to understand that the F-16s that we're talking about here are very old platforms. These are some of the older ones that in many cases were ready to be decommissioned because they were old. These are not some of the newest, most upgraded F-16s, which the United States has up to this point not provided. So the platform itself is a much older variant, and it's a whole different system than what the Ukraine side has had. And they've had a very consolidated, constricted training time frame to get into the air as soon as possible. And folks, listen, I can just tell you from personal experience, training for combat is an incredibly important issue that you have to get done at the individual level. As that video just showed you, at the mechanic level, you have to have the aircraft maintained. These things are also notorious for requiring enormous amounts of maintenance just to keep in the air. Apparently, for every hour the thing flies, it's got to have like 7 or 8 hours. I can't remember the exact number, but a much larger number of maintenance every time it flies. And that's by people who know what they're doing, who have no shortage of supply parts and other kinds of equipment that's necessary to keep those things maintained and flying properly. And that's just really hard to do. So not only do you have to train the pilots, you also have to train the technicians, or you have to hire them. And we're going to get into that in just a second as well. So the level of difficulty for the Ukraine side was always like a mountain to try to overcome. And then you have the issue of air defense. So even Americans, if we're flying F-35s or F-22s, these aircraft are also vulnerable to Russia's modern anti-aircraft systems and their air-to-air systems, their F-35s, their Su-35s, and several other of their attack aircraft as well, is something that's very concerning to well-trained American pilots in our system. And so it was always just a false hope, I think, to say that we're going to bring F-16s in any number in, and it's going to be the same as if NATO F-16s were flying, because it's just not. For example, the way the F-16s are, one of the reasons they're so effective is because it's part of an integrated system in the United States. You have AWACS, you have ground radars, you have other communications that are going on, oftentimes air to air, ground to air, etc. And it's in kind of this meshed up system so that the thing is able to operate in coordination with any ground attack forces, etc., so that they have a really good idea of what they're going after, both the anti-air and the anti-missile threat, as well as what's going on in the threat, to be able to attack a ground target or to shoot down, like that the U.S. did with some of our F-16s in the Middle East a few months back when Iran attacked Israel. But those things were kind of forgotten. So we've been talking all this time about these things coming in. Zelensky has been talking ad nauseum, and then earlier this month, I think it was on August the 4th, the F-16s were finally on the ground. The pilots were reported to be trained up and ready to go. And here's how Zelensky put it on that day.
Наших сил оборони. Ми часто чули у відповідь слово «це неможливо», але все ж ми зробили можливим те, що було нашою амбіцією, нашою оборонною потребою. А тепер це дійсно реальність у нашому небі. F-16 в Україні. Яка кількість, поки що та кількість, яка є в Україні, поки що та кількість пілотів, які вже навчені, цього ще недостатньо. Позитив є в тому, що ми очікуємо додаткових F-16. Позитив є в тому, що наші хлопці зараз, багато хлопців зараз навчаються.
You see that, like so many other things in this war, the Ukraine side thinks that if you have a good presentation, if you have a good video presentation, if you have a good speech, that is somehow going to matter. Folks, I'm just telling you, it doesn't matter how lofty and rhetorically soaring your words may be. If the ground truth reality doesn't match, it's irrelevant. And not only is it irrelevant, it could also be contradictory and sabotage your own effort. Because when people put their trust in these things that are coming in, okay, well, the F-16s are going to make a big difference. And then you see the very first time they fly, one of them goes down. Whether it was pilot error or whether it was being shot down is almost inconsequential in terms of the fact that the bottom line is you still lost that first airframe and you only had 6 to start with. Even if those other 2 that were reported weren't actually hit, now you're down to only 5. And according to Zelensky, he says the number they actually need is 100. Now, where they would get pilots for that is anybody's guess. And especially if it was pilot error on your best pilot, what does that say about the rest? And let's even look at what actually was accomplished. Zelensky claims that on Monday, those F-16s, however many were flying, shot down some of those missiles. But you saw the results of those missiles, right? You saw that. I don't know if you've seen the map, but literally every single oblast throughout the entire country of Ukraine was hit with missiles, not just attacked, but the missiles found their target, which means that the air defense system, whether it's the ground-based missile interceptors or the F-16s or whatever other aircraft they may have on their own, had almost no impact on the ground. It had, regardless of whether they actually did shoot some down or if it was also all just for show, is unknown. But what is known is that they haven't had any impact on the war itself, on the operational level. And that is the only thing that actually matters. And we had Lindsey Graham at the first of this operation where the Ukraine side has penetrated into the Kursk area. He went over in a gleeful way. We've talked about that before, but one of the things I wanted to point out about what he said was illustrative in a way that I'm sure he didn't realize. And he was talking about the F-16 pilots while he was there. Listen to what he says, because there's one big admission he doesn't realize he's about to make.
When it comes to F-16s, way too long. They're here. Let's use them. Let's train Ukrainian pilots. When I talked to President Zelensky just a few minutes ago, if you're a retired F-16 pilot and you're looking to fight for freedom, they will hire you here. They're going to look throughout NATO nations for willing fighter pilots who are retired to come help them until they can get their pilots trained. So we're going to get these jets in the air sooner rather than later, and we're looking for pilots who are willing to fight for freedom as the Ukrainians train their own pilots.
So you see, he said it nearly a half a dozen times in the span of that short little clip there. The Ukrainian pilots aren't adequately trained, and yet they're going up in the air. The first time they do, one of them, through alleged pilot error, falls down. Now, how willing do you think you're going to have 100 NATO pilots, 100 Western people who say, we want to get in those planes, and they know how difficult it's going to be to fly against the Russians? And God forbid if we find out that the truth is that the pilot was actually shot down, and that's why he lost his life. How much less so? But see, that just illustrates what I've been saying so many times on this show and throughout the course of this war, that the F-16 by itself is not a panacea. Even if you brought the American system itself in there, the whole system, the AWACS, the maintainers, the pilots, all the things that go along with it, they're still vulnerable to the Russian side. American pilots know that. Western pilots know that. I mean, what good is it going to do if they give you $100,000 for flight if you're not allowed to use it? And that's exactly what you're going to face. And so, unless Lindsey wants to get up in that plane and fly it himself and, take the risk of his life, which he's not going to do, that it's not likely that a lot of other people are either, but especially because if you get the guys who actually are trained, they know how limited the F-16 is in the best of circumstances against Russian air defenses, and they know it won't be the best of situations because they're going to have minimal maintenance on the ground, and those are older aircraft, and they don't have the system. And now then, it's just, again, the money doesn't even matter. Who's going to fly in situations like that when they know and they want to get on board with the Ukraine side wants them on board? I get it. You want them. You want to expand the fleet. You want to have this because you want to have the same capability that NATO aircraft have, but it's not going to make any difference, folks. And this is just this common theme that is throughout this war. You have all kinds of made for TV kind of moments like this one. You know, they had the band playing, they had the guy kneeling down there. It was great imagery. What's the impact on the battlefield? There was no impact on Russia's missile attack across the country. And now then you lost one of your pilots and aircraft on the first time. That's the reality. And that just kind of permeates throughout this entire war. This whole attack into the Ukraine, from the Ukraine side into Russia in the Kursk area, the collapsing front line in the eastern front there in the Pokrovsk, possibly even in the Kupiansk and in the Toretsk area, many other places, things are starting to buckle. And instead of acknowledging the reality, and instead of acknowledging that the Russian side continues to expand its war machine, we continue to talk like none of those things are happening. We don't like those kinds of facts, so we just pretend that they don't exist, and we go on. We took this situation here. We pretended that it's not hard to train pilots. It's not hard to bring a Western aircraft into a system that's never had it, and we just ignored it. But then you see that's the truth, and that seems to happen every time. Whatever we're talking about, Western tanks, no difference. Western armored personnel carriers, no difference on the battlefield. The Ukraine still lost its offensive. They still are getting them destroyed by the bucket loads in their offensive operation into Kursk area. They don't even have enough in the front lines. Now it's the infantry primarily in the eastern part of that. All the realities keep going through. The realities don't care about your preference. They don't care about your nationalism. They don't care about evil and wicked and right and wrong and the good and the dark. Weapons don't care. Weapons used in the hands of an angel or in the hands of a demon are identical. And if you just want to wish it to be so, what you're doing is you're ending up condemning your own people to death and your own cause to failure. And at some point, either we're all, and I'm talking about the West writ large, not just Ukraine, but the West writ large, we're going to have to acknowledge the hard truth of reality of what ground combat and air combat is really all about, or we're going to end up sacrificing Ukraine and their people on the altar of our arrogance. That's the big, big worry I have. And there are significant consequences of that. We're going to talk about some of that later this afternoon. We have Jason back on again. We hadn't had him in a while, Jason Beardsley, who's going to talk about Ukraine's, quote, victory plan that Zelensky talked about, I think, just yesterday. We talked about it a little bit. He's going to get into what the reality of that is. So on a bigger level, do tune in on that. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't. Share this with other people. Let them know what's coming down the pike here, because, folks, this is one of the few places you will get the truth. And I promise you, we will give it to you no matter what it is, good or bad for any side here. All I care about is the accurate information. Thanks, and we'll see you shortly on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.